be hosting Marina Perez de Arcos, who is currently at Yale University as a Europe Horizon and UKRI, United Kingdom Research Initiative, Global Fellow. She is originally from Spain, but also has spent a great deal of time in Great Britain. And she did her doctorate at Oxford University, one of my alma maters too. And she then taught international history at the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE, and founded a couple of programs there dealing with the particular branch of international history that she was interested in, which has to do with Spain. And the topic of today's seminar has unexpectedly gained current relevance in light of comments made by the President of the United States, who threatened to try to expel Spain from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He has no authority to do that, and there is no procedure for it. Nonetheless, that, of course, is similar to comments made about a blockade in the Arabian Gulf, where you just basically disregard everything that's said. So in any case, the topic, though, the topic is about the referendum that was held in Spain in 1986. Spain had, even though it had close military ties with the United States throughout the Cold War, it had not been admitted into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization until after the death of Francisco Franco. And he died in the mid-1970s, and then over a process of several years, Spain was admitted into NATO in 1982. And then the whole topic of membership came up for a referendum that will be the subject of today's seminar, and there's no one better to address that topic than Marina. So please go ahead.
Thank you so very much, Mark, for the kind introduction and the invitation, and for allowing me to wrap up the seminars of the year here. I've spent many years at Oxford, and it's actually really quite nice to be on this side of the pond now and feel the enthusiasm that these walls and halls and the people who make these seminars and classes possible have within them. And so indeed, my topic, or the topic I'll discuss today, is Spain's 1986 referendum. And just to hark back to Mark's references to the current president's words, yes, I mean, there were some that was said just a few days ago, but already in December 2025, when he met with the Finnish Prime Minister, he said, well, Spain, you have to call them and find why they're laggard. Maybe you should throw them out of NATO, frankly. Now, it's not just the fact that you can't throw an allied member just like that, throw out, but more importantly for the subject of today's talk, is that utterance would have not even be possible had Spain not stayed in the Atlantic Alliance in 1986. So Spain is the only NATO country to have held a vote on continued membership of NATO. No other country has held such a vote. Other countries who wished to join NATO did hold a referendum in the 1990s and 2000s, but not for continued membership. So that. And also it's important to remember that Spain joined, as Mark said, in 1982 after applying for membership in 1981. And that was a sort of a 30-year hiatus since the last member had joined NATO, and that was West Germany. So it was a very important vote, to the extent that it came up on the cover of the New York Times, and The Economist ran sort of a special issue about Spain a couple months after the referendum, Spain Ahoy, and the referendum in Spain mobilized hundreds of thousands of people. Protests on the streets, mainly against remaining in NATO. And we'll go into the intricacies of these protests in a few moments. But just to give you a sense of the structure of my talk, what I'd like to focus on is on the NATO referendum's significance. And I'd like to proceed sort of in 3 steps. The first is, why does it matter? So for present day politics, why is this event of actually 40 years ago this year, why is it still of relevance? 2, why did it matter? So back then. And then 3, how did the referendum significance play out in practice at that time? So basically, I'm going from the present day and then moving backwards. Just to give you a sense of where I've pulled up all this, all my data, my evidence. It's been a lot of globetrotting to collect archival materials from over 13 countries. And so NATO allies, including Spain, of course, 3 Warsaw Pact countries, and a couple of neutral countries as well, sort of to give the different perspectives, or to gain the different perspectives on this, on the referendum. And also complemented with interviews with policymakers at the time from the States and Spain, and the kind of archival material that I've been looking at are, well, mainly uncited, unreferenced, or things I had to declassify as well. So again, the first section, why does it matter? Why does this referendum matter? Especially considering that it is a subject that scholars, historians have not really spent much time looking at. So for the present day, why does it matter? Well, many of the so-called facts are inaccurate and are being used for contemporary political point scoring today. And they're of different kinds. So one is the referendum results, both its distribution and the difference between Remain and Leave. Secondly, the election pledges that surrounded the campaign, the general election campaign of October 1982, which came before the March 1986 NATO referendum. And then thirdly, the nature of the referendum itself. I'll unpack each of these as I go along. So firstly, inaccurate results. So if you type NATO, Spain, referendum, you'll probably, or most people will probably end up on Wikipedia and pull out a set of results. And one would think, well, they must be correct. I mean, they're just numbers. Well, it happens to be the case that they're not correct, neither in Spanish, nor in French, nor in English. And we then see people like the former deputy prime minister of Spain, who then left government and continued to do his television shows. He quotes Wikipedia in one of these languages. So this one would think, well, the scholarly literature must be a bit better than that. Well, actually, no. It either quotes, again, I would assume from Wikipedia, or it simply gives one of the, or just says it was a tight vote and doesn't actually give the election results. So just have a look at what these results say. So 56-43, the actual results are 52-39. And often only sorry, I'll go back for a second. Only the 43% often again in the scholarly literature, is the result that's given, and not even the Remain vote is referred to, meaning that it gives, it's misinformed. It's misinforming the reader of what the distribution of these results was. And not only that, but it also connected to the actual results. There's very often a judgment of how tight the result, the win for Remain was. So just to compare it to the UK's EU referendum in 2016, so that's 30 years after the NATO referendum. And the reason why this is also important is because there have only been 3 referenda on continued membership of an international organization, of an important European organization, and that is the 2 UK votes on the EEC in 75 and on the EU in 2016, and the NATO referendum. So to go back to the EU referendum of 2016, there was a 4-point difference. But actually, the Spanish result, the NATO referendum result, was a 13-point difference. So it's actually not as tight as commentators affirm, and definitely not if you compare it to the EU referendum in the UK, which again, analysts also use as a point of reference. So this is the perspective from today, but if we go back and look at the archival material, at the time, it wasn't felt by those who were campaigning to leave NATO that was a tight result, not at all. So in a conversation in Bucharest, the former Secretary General of the Spanish Communist Party was speaking to Ceausescu, and he acknowledged the resounding success of the vote to remain. And he even stressed that it had particularly resonated with working class areas that traditionally were influenced by left-wing politics. And even one of the leaders of what was called the State Coordinator of Pacifist Organizations publicly acknowledged that, quote, if anything, we were prepared for a loss by 4 or 5 points, so like the EU referendum in the UK, at most, but we were greatly taken aback by the 13-point lead. It is a significant blow. And a British commentator who was head of the Defense Department of the British Foreign Office, he wrote in a telegram that the outcome had been the biggest success, not only in the Spanish context itself, but also it showed, contrary to the impression sometimes created by the press and public opinion polls, that there was a considerable body of public support in alliance countries for NATO. And if one looks at the limited scholarly literature on Spain and NATO more generally, or Spain and US relations, or cultural output, media output today in Spain, one would not think that this is the case that these different commentators at the time were making. And of course, also the results themselves. Now, another way in which the NATO referendum results and the NATO referendum campaign is used in contemporary politics today in Spain is, for instance, by the current Spanish Prime Minister, who both in his 2023 memoirs, which he wrote or was helped to write while in office, and also in an interview he gave in July 2023, in the run-up to the general elections, he was asked to define what lying was. And to justify his changes of opinion on different matters of high politics in Spain, he used the example of, well, the Spanish Prime Minister, who was also belonged to the Spanish Socialist Party, like him, he changed his mind about NATO and said that Felipe González, that Spain was not going to join NATO, but actually then he campaigned to join NATO. The dates don't match at all. The years don't hold, and I have to say he should know his own political party's history better. And indeed, if one looks at the election pledges of 1982 of the Spanish Socialist Party, it specifically says that if they come to power, the Socialist Party comes to power, that they will hold a referendum on NATO membership, but they don't manifest what position they will hold on whether they will campaign to remain or leave. That's not mentioned. However, again, the Spanish collective memory and the media and even some scholars don't get this wrong and suggest or actually affirm that the Spanish Prime Minister campaigned in the 1982 elections. He ran on a campaign to leave NATO and hold a referendum in order to leave NATO. And again, the dates don't match, considering that Spain held the Madrid summit in 2022 as to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Spain joining NATO in 82. So you can't join NATO in 86 if you've already joined it in 82. Now, that's connected to, indeed, the nature of the referendum. And there are plenty of examples, whether it's the media, newspapers, scholarly books, whether they are of political science and international relations or history, where the nature of the referendum itself is wrong. So often, well, as you see here, NATO accession referendums, under that, the Spain referendum is listed, but it wasn't a referendum to join. Spain was already in NATO. It had been in NATO for 4 years. Often when anniversaries come up, there will be news pieces even in the public television channel or the radio public radio programs, where one will notice that the dates are inaccurate, and the nature itself of the referendum is inaccurately portrayed. Even in books such as this 2023 book by a very well-known journalist who from The Economist, who has spent decades in Spain and is extremely wise about Spain. And well, you open the book and the paragraph on the NATO referendum again gets the facts wrong. Now, again, so still on the first section, why does it matter? So the NATO referendum is very much still in the collective memory of the far left in Spain. And in fact, the junior coalition partner in the current government has repeatedly put forward non-binding parliamentary motions calling for Spain to leave NATO. Although, to be said, these proposals have been decisively rejected by a large majority of MPs. But again, we go back to the former Deputy Prime Minister of Spain, who very poignantly in this program of his recalls how important it was for him to go to these protests I showed you in one of the first slides with his parents. And it was his sort of formative political upbringing, in a sense. And and has very fond memories in a way of that experience. Another reason why it matters still today is, as I said, that it's one of the 3 referendums on continued membership in key post-war international organizations in Europe. And what we saw, and I definitely saw while living in the UK in 2016 and engaging with British diplomats and policymakers at the time, is that they felt that there was nothing really to fall back on in terms of historical references on how to manage a referendum of this nature. And it really felt at the time that it was somewhat of a déjà vu, forgotten or misremembered, as I shared with you just now, these misinformations or pieces of misinformation. And in fact, what happened, just to push it a bit more, is that after the 1975 referendum in the UK, during the Cold War, right after it, the publications on this subject fell drastically, and it only made a gradual comeback, at first very slowly, around 2016. So during the EU referendum. So in a sense, there wasn't literature on historical literature on the 75 referendum, but also there wasn't on the 1986 referendum in Spain. So there weren't, for policymakers, I mean, there weren't these historical, well-researched projects that could be useful to them in terms of campaigning, and perhaps the pioneering book on the 75 referendum in the UK, the author Robert Saunders writes that it was neglected by historians and political scientists, and 1975 has become the property more of myth than of history. And I think one could also say that when it comes to the NATO referendum of 1986. Now, leaving aside a little bit why it matters, or some of the reasons why I think it matters today, let's go back to why did it matter? And of course, a big reason is that Spain was the last country to join NATO during the Cold War, and potentially could have been the first to leave. So it was a bit of a last in but first out, possibly, and a victory, as Margaret Thatcher, in fact, this is paraphrasing her, a victory for the Leave side could create problems for other NATO member governments. And by calling this referendum and Remain in the end winning, in a sense, the referendum put to rest the most polemical and divisive issue of 1980 Spain. And also, it sort of closed the last piece of the Cold War puzzle in Western Europe, by holding this referendum and Remain winning, sort of ensure that the last country to join NATO would indeed stay. And I thought it was fun that today is the 5th of May. Well, 41 years ago, on the 5th of May in Spain, there was a massive protest against the US bases in Spain, against Spain's membership of NATO. And as you can see, there was a sort of a play on words and images around President Reagan as a bit of a wild cowboy. I mean, there are plenty of plays on words there. One of them is Reagan lo que Reagan, and that means, or that's it's a pun, and it would be something like whatever they say, or whatever Reagan says, no to NATO bases out neutrality. Another reason why the NATO referendum of 86 mattered is because it pushed the Spanish Communist Party, which had been the bulwark opposition party to the Franco dictatorship, out as a possible party of government. And after the referendum of 86, the Spanish Communist Party never ran or has ever run an election on its own, but rather in a coalition with several other parties, in a sense, diluting itself, particularly considering its key history in dissent and opposition to the Franco regime. And it also enabled the British Labour Party to play internal party politics in Spain around this issue, because they themselves were having internal strife around Britain's alignment and its NATO membership. So we have these two figures here. This is Tony Benn, and that's Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, was much, much younger when he signed the foreword with Tony Benn of this pamphlet called Peace Through Non-Alignment, The Case for British Withdrawal from NATO. And see, it's authored by Ben Lowe, who also writes this pamphlet, La cara oculta de la OTAN, so the hidden face of NATO, and which he published just in time for the referendum campaign in Spain. And what's fascinating is that both Tony Benn, who was sort of the unofficial far left leader within the Labour Party, and the official actual leader of the Labour Party at the time, Neil Kinnock, they both arrive in Madrid to campaign for different sides of the argument. In the couple of months just in the run-up rather to the referendum. So Neil Kinnock, he gives he speaks to the press along with the Spanish president Felipe González, and he says, it reflects the credibility of González and the PSOE. It is, and he means the referendum. The referendum is a very positive action from a democratic point of view, and the Spanish people will reward them with an affirmative vote at the polls. Whereas Tony Benn, on the other hand, he goes and meets with the anti-NATO activists and also the anti-NATO sector within the Spanish Socialist Party, which is called the Izquierda Socialista, the Socialist Left. And so he says it is the first time that people of a European country have the opportunity to give their opinion on an issue as important as the Atlantic Alliance. And of course, he says that people should vote to leave. Another reason why it mattered is because, contrary to the established narrative, the referendum actually put pressure on NATO and European Union or European Economic Community allies to speed up Spain's European accession. So again, to remind ourselves, the referendum was held in March '86. Spain officially joined the EU, the EEC, in January '86, but it had signed the treaty to accede the EU in June '85. And the final negotiations actually ended in March '85. So the conventional narrative says that the Socialist Party government had to change, was forced to change its opinion on NATO in order to get in to the European community. The evidence, the archival evidence, doesn't show that at all. Quite the contrary. It was a bargaining chip, but it was the opposite bargaining chip. In other words, the Spanish Prime Minister could go to his interlocutors around the NATO capitals and say, well, if you want us to stay in NATO, you better give me reasons and Spaniards reasons to stay. So you should better speed up the negotiations for us to join the European community. Another reason why it mattered is that the referendum allowed a newly democratic mid-sized country to navigate Cold War pressures, ultimately using them to strengthen its sovereignty while advancing its integration in the international system. So there was a balance, or there was an interaction there between seeking autonomy and also integration in the international system. And importantly, it enabled Spain to recover pockets of sovereignty and establish a much more balanced relationship with the United States. So as Mark mentioned, the original agreement between Spain, Franco's Spain in 1953 with the United States, which was then updated several times, meant that that there were US bases set up around Spain, but that the status of these bases, the amount of US troops, and the type of bases actually changed drastically after the NATO referendum, which enabled a very different sort of negotiation around the 1988 Agreement on Defense and Cooperation with the US. So the referendum conditions, this is the ballot, and just to summarize the conditions in English, one, Spain would not enter the NATO integrated military command structure. So that's also a reference to how France's status at this point, after General de Gaulle, what their status was. So being in NATO, but not in the integrated military command structure. The second condition was that Spain would remain non-nuclear. And the third and very important condition was that the US's military deployment in Spain would be reduced considerably. And so actually, Spain went from these 4 US bases, and it's important to note that how close these bases are to, one, the capital city. So just a few kilometers from the downtown Madrid is Torrejón de Ardoz, and Zaragoza, which is a very important Spanish city, also had very close by another US base. So after the 1988 agreement between the US and Spain, those 2 bases that were close to important cities were shut down, and the 401st Squadron of F-16s were sent out of Spain. They had to find a new home for them, so they ended up in Italy. And only 2 bases remained, but the sovereignty of them was different. They are Spanish bases, and both the US and Spain can use them. And it also meant that 40% of US troops were reduced. So I contend that the referendum, based on the archival material, was key in order to make this result possible. And it's true that at first the US administration felt that maybe after the referendum, well, no one would remember what the conditions were that were listed in the ballot. But their Spanish counterparts were very clear and explicitly used the referendum as a strong argument to make to their interlocutors, saying, sorry, the conditions of the ballot specifically said that US troops needed to be reduced. Therefore, we need to negotiate with that in mind. That needs to be the starting point. Now, to the third section, the third and final section, you're bearing with me very patiently. So how did the referendum's significance play out in practice at the time? So firstly, there were intense direct and indirect Allied pressure to persuade the Spanish Prime Minister González not to call what Secretary of State Schultz referred to as that bloody referendum. So NATO allies, the States, Germany, Britain, Italy, they really were not keen at all that Spain would hold such a referendum. It created a precedent to start off with, but also there was a possibility, a grave possibility in their eyes, that Spain would actually leave, considering the polls. And in 1985, in fact, González, in a conversation with Chancellor Kohl, he said to him, many allies had asked me or had asked him not to hold the referendum. But he explained that a renunciation would have many more negative consequences in Spain, especially for such a young democracy, one that would create a credibility crisis. Very often one sees in the archival material that the US asks the Italians to please talk to González, that the British asked the Germans to please speak to González in order to get him to change his mind about holding the referendum. And tons of US telegrams from Ambassador Enders reporting back, saying, well, if we put pressure, we need to do it. If we continue to put pressure, we need to do it in a very delicate way, because otherwise it will backfire. In the end, they were unconvincing. However, once it became clear that the referendum would indeed go ahead, then the pressure shifted. And that went to the opposition leader, Manuel Fraga, to get him to campaign in favor of Remain. Now, these efforts were both to convince the Socialist Party not to hold the referendum were not successful, but also the pressure to convince Fraga to, who's a conservative, to campaign for Remain are also unsuccessful. But that Fraga story is quite illustrative, so I'll spend a bit of time on that. So these are some notes on Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's conversations with Fraga already from July '85 to try to convince him to campaign in favor of staying in NATO. So actually, in the summer of '85, Fraga goes over to London, and they speak to each other, and he gives the impression both to Mrs. Thatcher, but also to Geoffrey Howe, who was the Foreign Secretary, that he's not going to drive up and down the country and campaign fervently to Remain, but he will campaign. So not super enthusiastically, but he will. And that's what he tells his British counterparts. And it's interesting that Margaret Thatcher actually uses the reference to the '75 EEC referendum in Britain to make the case to Fraga, saying, I was not in government at the time of the EC referendum. In fact, I was the opposition party leader, and it was a Labour Prime Minister who called for the referendum for Britain to stay in the European community. And, well, I came out with my European jumper and campaigned in favor to Remain. Because, well, she believed that was the right thing to do at that particular stage. And more interestingly, the Spanish ambassador to London at the time was actually Fraga. So what we end up getting is that the White House officials called the Fraga saga, which was Fraga trying as much as he could to get a photo opportunity with President Reagan, and even used people like the Spanish singer Julio Iglesias to try and convince the White House officials to on the grounds that he was a super NATO champion. He didn't get the photo op, but he also didn't campaign to remain in NATO. And in fact, what has been termed as the González U-turn was actually Fraga's U-turn. And he actively campaigned for abstention, so not to participate in the NATO referendum. And that campaign, well, used that abstention was the sensible answer or the intelligent answer. And this was incomprehensible to NATO allies of the center-right and conservative leaders, to the extent, and it was so important, and this goes back to the question of why it mattered at the time, to the extent that all these people, maybe you'll recognize some, all these people were sent over to Fraga in the lead up to the campaign, to the referendum, to convince him to campaign for Remain. So we have here the German contingent here, at the top. So that's Ernest Albrecht, who was the president of the Land of Lower Saxony, and by the way, the father of the current European Commission president, Ursula von der Leyen. Then we have Franz Josef Strauss, who was the CSU and president of the Land of Bavaria, and also Peter Hartmann, who was a very close advisor of Chancellor Kohl. So all three of them fly over to Madrid, some of them with a letter to try, from Kohl, to try and convince Fraga to campaign for Remain. But we also have the British contingent here. And this is Tristan Garel-Jones, who was the Conservative whip in the British Parliament of Westminster. And he spoke Spanish perfectly. He was married to a Spaniard. And also Baroness Els, who was the vice president of the European Parliament. And at the time, Fraga's party, which was a coalition, a set of different parties that came together, was trying to join the European Conservative Popular Party at the time. So actually Baroness Els had an important role in that. And she went over to Spain with a letter from Mrs. Thatcher herself to convince Fraga. And here at the very end, we have Richard Allen, who was Reagan's national security advisor. And he also went over with a letter, a personal letter from Reagan to Fraga.
When was that? When did he go?
Just before, a few days before the referendum.
Okay, because hadn't he been, I thought he had to leave.
I think that was later.
Okay, well, anyway,
yeah.
it does.
So he went over, and Fraga said he was very grateful for this personal letter of President Reagan's, but he had to keep to his abstention position on Spain's continued membership of NATO. Now, again, because of the wonders of archival research, connected to the importance of Fraga's abstention campaign, which of course was targeted to more conservative voters, and these more conservative voters had thought very highly of the Spanish king at the time, King Juan Carlos. And what's striking here is that he and his wife, Queen Sophia, and their daughters, they all turned up to vote, which was the total opposite of what Fraga was encouraging his voters to do. And as I was just saying, the wonders of archival research. So where could we potentially find the vote of, or the manifestation of what King Juan Carlos had voted in the referendum? Well, he told the Austrian neutral ambassador what he voted, and he told him that he had voted to remain. But he didn't tell a NATO ally ambassador, but rather neutral Austria. And you could tell no one had looked at that file because the band just disintegrated when I touched it. So again, it speaks to looking in unexpected places for archival materials. Again, how did the referendum significance play out in practice? Well, not only was there pressure put on Fraga, but González actually encouraged and asked European leaders, and it was European leaders, to agree to speak in favor of Spain staying in NATO. So that was Chancellor Kohl, but also, and importantly, his Socialist International friends and colleagues, such as Willy Brandt, who was the president of the Socialist International and the former Chancellor of West Germany and Nobel Peace Prize winner, but also Mário Soares from Portugal. And there was this idea of Europeanizing NATO for voters. And also, very importantly, was for González to be able to get the US to agree to negotiate a reduction of US troops and bases in Spain before the NATO referendum. So there wasn't, the agreement was only finalized in 1988, but there was a memorandum of understanding that was signed in December 85, so 3 months before the referendum, with the US agreeing that they would revise what the US troops and bases were in Spain. And you could sort of see these 2 points expressed here in the newspaper, the official newspaper of the Spanish Socialist Party, which went around all local offices in Spain and framing NATO as a European organization on the one hand, and the first point says the future of Spain is in Europe, and one cannot have a protagonist role in Europe if you disconcern yourself from its security problems. And at the same time, very nicely, strategically placed on the right, they're informing socialist voters, who would be the ones reading such a newspaper, that the US and the Spanish government had agreed to revise the agreement and renegotiate troop reduction. This is almost my final slide. But it also, the way it was played out, the referendum also brought in the transnational, ecological, anti-nuclear and peace movements across Europe, and they engaged very actively in the Leave campaign. So Petra Kelly, who was the founder of the Green Party in Germany, she also flew over to Spain and campaigned actively for the Leave campaign, and also engaged 13 ex-generals across Europe to manifest themselves against NATO and in favor of the no vote. And also what one can see from materials from from the communist bloc is that the security services had been engaged in supporting the peace movement in Spain for quite a while. So on the one hand, these protests and were grassroots movements of different kinds, communist, anarchist, but at the same time, and ecological, so grassroots, but at the same time, there was also an interference from the Eastern Bloc. So I hope I've covered all 3 points, or all 3 sections. Why does the referendum matter? Why did it matter? And also how its significance was played out in practice at the time. And it just beckons us to remember accurately. And to quote one of my favorite professors from back in the day at Oxford, and to say it with documents. And just to finish off with a quote from The Economist at the time, this year's surprise Spanish yes to the Atlantic connection showed that for all the anti-American shouts on right and left, most Spaniards do not agree with the shouters. And if you'd like to know more, coming soon, there is an article coming out in the summer 2026 edition with the Journal of Cold War Studies. Millions of Europeans are watching and reevaluating the 1986 NATO referendum. Until then, thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent presentation, Marina. Let me commend you on really a model of how to give the presentation. So let me ask a few questions that come up here. They're mostly specific questions. For example, one of them has to do with, you mentioned Petra Kelly, but I'm in some ways more interested in what the SPD in West Germany was, what stance it was taking, and whether they were also encouraging a no vote as Kelly. With Kelly, it's not surprising. That's exactly what I would expect of her, especially in light of some of the later revelations that she was receiving funds from the KGB. But in any case, so if you could comment on that, the position of the West German SPD, and whether they sent people over to try to take a position on one side or the other. Going back though to where you started, what accounts for those discrepancies in Wikipedia? What were people looking at to get the numbers? Because it wasn't really close, it was quite far off. It's not as though they must have been using something that was really botched from the, sort of a common source, because at least 2 of those versions have the same figures. There were also you referred a few times to polls before the referendum. Could you comment a little bit more on those? Because at least the quotations that you had here suggested that the referendum was going to be very close and might go against staying in NATO. Was that the case? Did the polls actually show that? And then 2 final questions. One with regard to Richard Allen. I'm pretty sure he must have been used as a special envoy by Reagan, because I think he had to step down as national security advisor in 1981 when some diamonds turned up in a safe in his office. It wasn't that he was trying to steal them, but it caused controversy. So I think he was replaced by Reagan's attorney general. I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but but I don't think he stayed on as national security advisor after that point. He was undoubtedly some kind of special envoy. Then finally, it would be interesting to look through the Mitrokhin files at Churchill College, Cambridge, the Churchill Archive Center, because even though Mitrokhin had left, stepped down as the head archivist at the KGB, the Foreign Intelligence Service of the KGB. He was there until 1984. And so it's possible that you would find materials already at that point, or certainly from 82 to 84, about what the Foreign Intelligence Service of the KGB was hoping to do to enlist people in Spain to oppose membership. That's a future project that you can do. It's you don't have to do it now, but it would be interesting because those files are now fully accessible at the Churchill Archive Center. So please, you can take these, and then I'll come to the audience.
I'll answer these. I have enough, and then of course you can ask. So on Petra Kelly and well, the SPD. So at the time, there's a division, as you know, within the SPD and also around the Euro missiles. But in particular for Spanish socialists, the reference point is Willy Brandt, and also how and Willy Brandt was one of the key people to push forward the 1959 Bad Godesberg rule book for the SPD, and what that meant was that they embraced both European integration and also NATO membership. And but indeed, the SPD in a sense was a little bit like the Labour Party at the time, sort of giving different signals depending on which group. So for instance, the youth, the SPD youth was also interested in this, and of course on the Leave side. On the Wikipedia results, now I think partly the answer is just not being careful, and basically, frankly, sloppiness.
Any idea of where they got those figures? Because
so on the sloppiness, so the issue with some of these inaccurate Wikipedia results is that they discount the blank votes, and so because they don't take them into account, then they create this over 100%. And so that's what they use. But so I don't necessarily think in one set of cases it's done on purpose. It's just sloppiness that they don't discount the blank votes, and then the distribution of the percentages goes haywire. On the other hand, however, I do think that the inaccuracy of the results, or giving them in or referencing them in a partial way, is a political statement, or it's politically motivated, depending on which side of the political spectrum and one is on. So I think that there is also some of that, and thirdly, the NATO referendum, despite its significance, which was what I was trying to showcase today, hasn't been properly researched. So then there was no one who took the time to actually correct it and to challenge it and to say, well, where did you get this from? So I think those are some reasons. On your third question with regards to polls, yes, indeed, the result of the referendum was not tight. However, the win, the lead up to the referendum day, that was tight. So polls did suggest up until the very end that Leave would win. I found the telegram of the British ambassador the day before, and of the day when the results came out, the day after, and there you see the shift. But he's surprised himself, and in fact also a British official, a couple days before the day of the referendum, he has lunch with one of the Spanish president's closest collaborators and long-time friend from their student days. And they were talking about, well, this is looking awful. And the prime minister's collaborator says, yeah, but also this is going to mean that the prime minister will leave office. If what he's put forward and campaigned very strongly and personally for Remain is not going to be supported by Spanish voters, then he ethically believes he needs to go. And the British official sort of discounts that. He doesn't think that that's a very a very solid argument. But then you can also see that he doesn't really know much about the recent history of the Spanish Socialist Party and of the Prime Minister González, because if one did, then you would take it seriously, because he did leave the Spanish Socialist Party's the helm of the party in 1979 on an issue around Marxism. So that's about the polls, and I deviated slightly as well. But on Richard Allen, absolutely, I think you're right. I think he was special envoy. So my bad. And then on the archives at Cambridge, brilliant, because I'm writing a chapter for my monograph on Spain in the 1970s and 80s, and so Spain in the last years of the Cold War, and it's an international history. So there's a chapter on sovereignty and NATO and relations with the US. So that'll be great.
Very good. So please.
Yes, I was interested both in the historiography of what you're doing, but also in your findings. But I have two, one larger question and then one specific historiography question. How, so you did a wonderful job of telling the story of all the people that were in the opposition and all the people that were pro, and these wonderful letters that are going back and forth between leadership. I know just the reference that I'm using is like a California-based referendum. They're very expensive to run, and there's a lot of money running on either side. Mm-hmm. Who was financing the referendum in Spain? Were you able to trace the dollars or whatever currency was being transferred back and forth between the opposition party? Who was funding the opposition party and who was funding the pro? Right, because obviously these are very expensive to run and maintain, and it seems just from the news coverage that this was. There was a great deal of interest and a lot of interested parties, right? So where was the money coming from? Were you able to get those details? And then just this historiography question. Did you have a chance to work in the NATO archives? Because I'm interested, not many people have really successfully navigated the NATO archives and found something worthwhile. So if you did, what was your experience working with the NATO archives and accessibility in terms of what you were actually able to find there?
On the NATO archives, I've tried unsuccessfully, and they just tell me they're not open for this period. So one also needs to bear in mind that this is the 1980s. So earlier materials are available, are accessible, but not for the 1980s, unfortunately. I have looked at some materials in the NATO archives, but they're not internal documents. So some sort of public diplomacy materials, but not internal documentation. On where the money came from, so in Spain, political parties for their elections, they're funded by public funds. So the more MPs you get, or the more representation you get, the more funds you get for an election or for a referendum. And so that's how a lot of it was, that's how the official funding happened. I will say two more things, though. One is the anti-NATO campaigns the vibe they tried to give was that they would come across as grassroots, that they were bottom up, that political parties were not involved, and that's totally not true. The Communist Party tried to used umbrella organizations that were sort of like a Catholic umbrella organization and funded them very generously with their public funding. But they just didn't want to give the impression that they were at the forefront, but rather did it without it being too obvious. So this sense of the anti-NATO movement being exclusively grassroots is inaccurate. There is a lot of that. There's a mix of sensitivities. There are religious sensitivities, but there's definitely funding coming from the Communist Party. And another thing that I discovered in the Romanian archives was that the former Prime Minister of Spain, Adolfo Suarez, who left office, and he was the Prime Minister when Spain's constitution was passed. He was upset with his own party for having taken Spain in to NATO. It happened a year after he had left office. And as I was saying, what I found in Bucharest was that his new party that he set up tried to get funding from Ceausescu. And I don't know whether they succeeded or not. That I wasn't able to see from the files. But there was definitely a form of, well, there was definitely, they definitely asked, or an envoy of his definitely asked. And lo and behold, his new party did very well in the general elections of June '86 that took place 3 months after the NATO referendum. So they went, they gained a very considerable representation after the referendum.
Could I actually follow on also from these questions? Was the referendum an ad hoc procedure, or was there something in the Spanish law that would allow for these sorts of referendums?
Yeah.
The way, say, in California.
Right. So the referendum was not legally binding, but when it was called for, the vice president who gave the sort of official speech said that it was politically and ethically binding. But it wasn't legally binding. Just like, in fact, the UK EU referendum of 2016, it wasn't legally binding, but politically binding. And yes, there were previous examples of a referendum being held, but they were sort of landmark referendums, like on the Constitution or on disbanding the Francoist courts, parliament right before. So there were examples of referenda being held, but not on a question of foreign policy. But also what's in a sense slightly incoherent is that Fraga, the opposition party leader, he had been one of the 7 fathers of the Constitution during the constitutional process. And one of the things that he pushed for, which was unsuccessful in the end, was for there to be more referendums. So he actually wanted, I mean, not quite the Swiss model at all, but he was pushing for more referenda to be held, for it to be more common, and that didn't go through. And then he didn't like this one.
Please. And then you, Nico.
Thank you very much, first of all, for your beautiful presentation. I'm curious to know what the French presidency was it in favor of the referendum, knowing that Mitterrand usually was wait and see which way it would go? And
thank you for the question and for the remark. So I've accessed President Mitterrand's papers, and again, that's a whole nother story of declassifying in the French National Archives, because presidential material actually officially not accessible for 50 years. So you really need to put in loads of letters and convince them to give you the materials, because you can actually see them, just not allowed to take pictures of them. So I spent many hours at in Pierrefitte-sur-Seine, where the French National Archives are, the new building, looking at these materials and transcribing. So that took a while. To your question, President Mitterrand didn't want a referendum like the other NATO allies, and he was in favor of Spain staying. But I've not been able to find much evidence of the French being particularly involved. The French were on the NATO question. On the European community question, they are fundamental. And when the NATO and the EEC issue sort of come together, then he plays a role. But the NATO issue on its own, not really.
Nikolai, did you?
Yeah, I was curious. When you said that the referendum was not legally binding, does it mean that, if there was a no result, there would be no consequence? Spain will still remain in NATO. Is that what you mean by legally binding, or you mean the decision to have a referendum? I don't know, is there a referendum law in Spain which basically has rules that if there is a minimum of vote, people who want to have a referendum, there will be a referendum.
Calling a referendum in Spain is the prerogative of the government. And what I meant by legally binding is that they're consultative. It's the law says that it is to sort of find out what voters' views on a specific issue are, but it's not legally binding in terms of a mandate of like a general election mandate, which is then representatives in parliament, but it was considered to be politically and binding but even if legally, it was merely a consultation.
So if the answer is not to join NATO, there will be no consequence legally.
Not to remain in NATO.
Remain in NATO. It wasn't about joining.
No.
I'm sorry, about remain. Yeah.
It's an important distinction because as she pointed out, during the Cold War, there never was a referendum about joining. It wasn't until after.
Yeah, and perhaps this referendum even sets a precedent for, of course, for other reasons as well, that some former communist bloc countries would have voted or taken membership to a referendum. But did that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess with Mark's remark that if the answer was that Spain does not remain in NATO, then there will be no consequence. There is no obligation.
There's no, not legally, but I mean,
yes.
if the no to NATO had indeed won, that would have been impossible to not do, politically speaking.
I also noticed that the support of, when you consider also the people for and the level of participation, the result was pretty low compared to other referendums later in post-communist countries.
Ah.
So probably one of the, I looked at, I don't know if the figures are correct. But it looked like it was the lowest level support. I looked at Slovenia, Slovakia, Hungary, and all those levels were much, Macedonia, the levels of support were higher than Spain.
So in terms of the millions of people who voted, it's a very similar amount to the referendum on the Spanish 1978 constitution. So which is an important reference point. But I should add, and I didn't mention this, that not only did the conservative party, so the Popular Party with Fraga at the helm, campaign to abstain. So that's already a big chunk of people who would have otherwise been inclined to vote Remain, telling them stay home. But also the nationalist conservative parties of the Basque Country and Catalonia told their voters, do as you wish.
But still, Catalonia was, I saw the region.
Was low.
There was, yeah.
But precisely for that reason. Precisely because the big parties, nationalist, regionalist parties of these territories these voters were being told, maybe not go to the beach, but hike a mountain. Just don't do as you please. Yeah, the Canary Islands also has a sort of a.
And also regarding the military command, I think one of the conditions was that Spain does not.
Yeah.
Was there any idea of not joining also only the political structure of NATO, like in France? Because you mentioned some of them.
Yeah.
Well,
So
France had been a
had
member
been-
of the integrated military command.
Yes.
Charles de Gaulle.
Some point they
The same happened with Greece, in response to
very-
the arms embargo that was imposed on Greece during the war with Turkey, and so the Greeks for, I guess it was about, I'm not sure how long it was, but pulled out of the integrated military command as well.
And on the Greece point, the socialist, the PASOK leader in Greece, when he won the elections in 1981, he actually ran on an election manifesto saying that he would call a referendum to pull out Greece from NATO. He never called for a referendum. However, what's interesting is that the ambassador the US sent to Greece to renegotiate the basis, the treaty with Greece, Bartholomew, he was the same person who the Reagan administration then sent to Lebanon during the Civil War in the early 80s there. And then, lo and behold, he was the one who was sent in 86 to Spain to, after the referendum, to negotiate with the Spanish government for the new treaty agreement, the defense agreement would be like, with the idea that he was a tough one, and so he would be tough to deal with.
Yeah, he was a very competent official, Reginald Bartholomew. He was from the State Department, and was a very highly respected official. Other questions? I'm not entirely clear why this room is so cold. It's quite in contrast to the temperature outside.
Very, yeah.
So I apologize for that if anyone like me has frozen here. So did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, just.
Oh, please, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to thank you. It was really clarifying for me to listen to you and, just make my mind more clear about what the process was. At that time, as a Spaniard, I had many doubts to about what the process was about. And also wanted to add a question that just I'm curious about, because it is said that the question that was like posed, posed on the referendum was quite confusing. And so it wasn't really a simple question about, do you want to leave or stay? On the contrary, it was like,
You have the word,
Yeah,
I think.
That's
So
the,
that is-
that's,
okay,
yeah,
all
that's
right,
the summary in English. Mhm.
so could you just
Elaborate on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I think the point was to, in a sense, make it clear to citizens, to the Spanish voters, but also as leverage for the future in negotiations with the US, what the conditions of Spain remaining in NATO would be. So it's not just, are you pro-NATO or anti-NATO, or pro-Remain, or anti-Remain, but rather in which conditions. So actually, you could say that it's more specific, and also gives more leverage for future.
I'm reading it now, I'm just reading it, okay. So it is convenient for you to remain in the Atlantic, but which is still kind of tricky, question. And also what you think about Felipe González when he was like, when he was running for president, he was like,
I had you ask that.
he like promised to Spaniards to kind of, if I'm the president, I just, will leave the NATO and will, it's just as a political kind of way of gaining elections. And then he had to kind of
Backtrack.
create,
So I'm very glad you asked that question, because that's another inaccuracy, but I didn't put it in at the very beginning. But I prepared an appendix just in case that popped up. So actually, if we look at González's public statements and his and the archival evidence on his conversations with President Carter and other European colleagues of his, he sends a letter to Willy Brandt, which I found in the archives in Bonn, the SPD archives there. He just an example of it. What he actually says is, I'm not against NATO. What I'm against, and this is before Spain joined in 82, what I'm against is Spain joining NATO, which is entirely different. In other words, no to Spain's entry into NATO and no to the simplistic rhetoric of yes to NATO versus no to NATO. And so this is in 1980, in 1981, there's plenty of evidence of this. But the difference is that Spain then joins in 1982. But Spain is not a member of the European community in 1982. So one of the issues that the Socialist Party and him specifically have is that the previous government has pulled in Spain into NATO without taking it to a general election, without there being consensus or seeking consensus in Parliament with the main opposition party. And this is also at a time when the government which pulled Spain in, is crumbling. So what is the question then is, what is their mandate to do so? And in particular, when it comes to foreign policy, the priority for them was, or for the Socialist Party, was to join the European community. And they felt that, well, you just gave up an extremely good card to play by just pulling us into NATO, and we could have gone into the European negotiations saying, yeah, you want us in NATO, then bring us in into the European community.
Okay, thank you. We're at the end of our
Thank you.
time, Maria. Thank you for.
Thank you. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
to the audience too. I'll be right back.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It went very well. I'm glad.
Awesome. Yeah, great.
Gracias. Am I still being filmed?
Yes, you are.
Ah,
Good call. Well, this is.
you can cut the last bit out.
Yeah, we definitely will cut it.
That was a great, I was amazed